Okay, so this is our lecture on public and private families. This is going to be our first lecture for this semester. And something to note is that this lecture is meant to be kind of a starting point. It's meant to be foundational. So we're going to go through over a lot of definitions, theories, things like that. So let's dive in. So throughout this course, we're going to explore multiple different family dynamics. The definition of family is going to vary based off who you ask, though. So some people would say that family is defined by blood. Some would say that family can be chosen. We also have different ideas about who and what makes a family. In this course, we'll learn about all the different ways we can define family, both in the public and the private sectors. It's important to note that, though, that these definitions are dependent upon historical and social context. So years ago, family was seen as two married people with children. Today, our definition of family has really expanded beyond the traditional nuclear family, which is that two-parent and a couple of children definition of family. Our definitions in the public sector are also dependent upon how the government and economic policies go about defining family. And again, this is something that we'll explore throughout the semester. Okay. So when we look at the public family, we need to think about how the government and economic policies would define or look at a family. So economists who specialize in public welfare tend to look at families through externalities. So there are negative externalities which occur when an individual or business produces something that is beneficial to itself but imposes negative costs onto others. So for example, a few years ago, the company that makes that sriracha sauce was producing tons of product and it was selling really well on the market. However, a bunch of people who lived near the factory where the sriracha was being produced complained of irritation in their eyes, nose, and throat. So it turns out that while the company was producing their product and creating getting lots of money from it and all that good stuff, the spices that they were using were irritating people in the community and causing allergic reactions. On the other hand, we have what are called positive externalities, which occur when an individual or business produces something that is beneficial to others, but the producer or the person making the product does not receive the full benefits of their product. So this sometimes happens at a university. So a university will hire a professor who just graduated with their PhD or their master's, typically their PhD. And after that professor has built their resume and has really established themselves in the field and as a prominent person in their field, a lot of the times they'll leave that original university to go to a better university. And the original university that provided them with a bunch of training or funding for research doesn't have that great professor anymore, nor their accolades that they're going to get throughout their career. So positive externalities sometimes involve what are called public goods, which means that anyone is able to enjoy them. So an example of a public good that I can give is in my hometown, we passed a proposition to update our local zoo and to reduce the overall cost of admission to that zoo. And a lot of people in my town really love that zoo. And we wanted to use our tax dollars to support it and make it better and more accessible for low income families in our community. So although the people in our town did really benefit from this, we also weren't able to stop people who weren't paying those extra tax dollars who came from out of town from coming to our zoo either. I do want to note though that the connection between families may be a little bit lost right now, especially when we're talking about economics. So just bear with me. Um, Researchers and theorists argue that families do produce public goods, except we tend to call those public goods children. So society has a really strong interest in today's children becoming good citizens, informed voters, and hopefully people who will pay taxes to support the systems we have in place. So for example, the Social Security system, when you retire, you get Social Security checks, and those checks are being paid for by uh, people who are already working. So their income gets taxed, and that goes to pay for people who are retired and earning or receiving uh, Social Security checks. So my grandma, she's in her 80s, so she gets Social Security checks, and someone in California, because I'm originally from California, is paying for that Social Security check. But when she was a nurse and working, she was like years ago, was paying for someone's Social Security back then. So we have the system in place where we need people to kind of support other people in our community. Um, so it's in society's best interest for families and parents to raise good children to be productive adults, so we can kind of keep things running and hopefully running better. The problem with investing in our future by relying on parents to raise good children is we run into what's called the free rider problem. And the free rider problem is defined as a tendency for people to obtain public goods by letting others do the work of producing them. So me and my dad actually recently discussed this problem. One of the things about the education system is schools are funded by property taxes. So that's why we see a great discrepancy in how schools are being funded. So for example, if you live in a high income area, the property tax is going to be much higher. But if you live in a low income area, the property tax is going to be much lower. And as a result, the places that have high income are going to have better funded schools, while places that are a little bit more low income, their funding for schools isn't as good. So me and my dad were discussing the pros and cons of that. And he made the point of saying, my kids are graduated, they're in college, or they're college graduates. I don't see why I have to pay higher taxes, and I don't see why my taxes have to go to a school that I'm never going to visit, or my children are never going to attend, my grandchildren are never going to attend. Like, I don't understand why I have to split it. Like, doesn't make sense. But if we think about how we're investing in education and how that's going to impact the future, I told my dad, those children are going to be the people who pay your Social Security check. So do you want them to have good jobs so you can get a little bit more out of it? Do you want educated people in the workforce who are going to potentially be taking care of you, or doing services for you? So that was a big debate in our household. But that is something that comes up, and that's an example of the free rider problem. My dad was like, well, I don't have to do anything because I don't actually have children. That's on other people to handle it. So that's an example of that free rider problem. And when we look at family through a more public lens, we look at, how a family contributes to public welfare. Therefore, when we define the public family, it's one or more adults who are jointly caring for a dependent and the dependents themselves. So dependents can include, it doesn't have to include children, but it can include people who are in need of care, elderly people, sick people, people like that. And when we think about joint care, keep in mind that joint care can mean multiple things. It doesn't have to mean that the care is limited to that husband and wife with children, and include multiple types of couples or multiple types of family members that either live together or do not live together. But they are caring for someone who's dependent. That is the key operative when we look at a public family, and what a family is in the public sector is that they have a dependent. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about the private family. So obviously, family is much more than a public service or a unit defined by a government entity. So let's dive into exactly what the private family would look like. The private family typically encompasses intimate relationships, whether or not they have dependents, though. So when we look at the private sector, you have to have a dependent if you're going to be considered a family. Sorry, in the public sector, to be considered a family, you have to have a dependent. But in the private sector, you do not have to have a dependent. And when we think of close relationships with our family, we think about, the daily interactions and the emotional connections we have with our family members. We're not thinking about, the public good that we can provide by raising people or caring for people. We also don't need to limit our family to ties of just blood family members. It can include romantic partners and friends as well. The clear definition of the private family, though, is two or more individuals who maintain a close emotional relationship and a commitment to each other, and who usually live in the same household and pool their incomes and household labor. So families today are becoming so diverse and complex that it's hard to determine their boundaries and what it means to be a family in this more private sector. So when we look at this definition, it's very broad and it encompasses multiple types of families. However, even families can be kind of confused or unsure about who is in the family. So, for example, sometimes single mothers may include their boyfriends and their children in their family, but the child may only count their mom as their family and not consider the mom's like newer romantic partner as part of their family. This can be what's known as boundary ambiguity, which is a state in which family members are uncertain about who's in or out of the family. Family can also refer to broader kinship ties, such as relationships with sisters, uncles, close family members, or friends and cousins. So the usual definition for kin is the people who are related to you by descent or by marriage. However, this definition has expanded to include two types of kin. So that's voluntary kin and assigned kin. So voluntary kin is kinship ties that people construct with people who they are not related to by blood or by marriage. And then assigned kin is kinship ties that people more or less acquire through marriage or blood. Voluntary kinship is really valuable for people who do not have great relationships with their assigned kin. Research has found that for LGBTQ individuals, they tend to construct voluntary kinships with family, select family members and friends if their assigned kin is prejudiced or unsupportive of them. And that's kind of where we get this term found family. And there's lots of upcoming research on found families, but there's not a lot out there. This is a more of a newer concept, but it is cropping up in family science. So let's create clear distinctions in what it means to be a family. So in the public family, it's typically married couples or cohabitating couples or single parents with children. And they're usually people who are caring for a parent, an ill partner, or children. Those are those dependents. Their goal as a family is to raise the next generation and to care for the elderly, the ill, and the disabled. The main problem that these types of families are going to experience is that free rider problem we talked about earlier. So that is the main hurdle they have to jump through as a public family is lack of investment from other people. The private family is typically going to include married or cohabitating couples with children. However, it doesn't necessarily have to have children. We can also include those found families, things like that. So that's typically what we see, but again, that definition of family is much broader. It also is more likely to be a network committed to an individual or to individual relationships. And the main goal for these families is to provide love, support, and intimacy. So again, it's much more of a personal and private experience, not focusing on what they can do for the public good. And the main problem that these families are going to experience is that boundary ambiguity or figuring out who's in this family. So now that we kind of understand what family is, depending on who you ask, how do we go about understanding families and how they function through a more scientific lens? So some people definitely struggle with the idea that you can scientifically study other people. One time I was at a conference for the National Council of Family Relations, and a bunch of us that were at the conference were on an elevator, and this person who was not part of the conference, not part of our field, came onto the elevator with us and asked, like, oh, what do you guys do? Like, why are you guys here at this conference? Like, what is this conference? So we tell them, like, oh, we're family scientists. This is what we do. Here's our research interests. And this person stops us and goes, is it real science or is it like, and excuse my French, like bullshit science? And we were like, excuse you, this is our life's work. It is not bullshit. So I'm going to explain to you how family science is not bullshit science. So first, when we study families, we want to be very objective by studying families through a lens that isn't affected by, the researchers' beliefs about what a family should look like. And that can be really hard since all researchers have their own experiences with families, own personal histories that may affect how they view the world and how they view families. So being objective and taking yourself kind of out of the equation of your research study is really important, but it's also kind of challenging to do. So in an attempt to be more objective and to take a more empirical and scientific approach, researchers tend to use the scientific method, which is a systematic and organized series of steps that work to maximize objectivity and consistency in research. There's also a movement called the open science movement, where researchers are being transparent about every single step of their research as they go through it. So that means showing their population, their data sets, so on and so forth. So being very transparent with other researchers as well as how they do it. So I kind of got ahead of myself there, but the first step to the scientific method is to formulate a hypothesis or a research question. So for my doctoral dissertation that I'm currently working on, I'm examining how unmarried fathers' romantic relationships with a mother influence their relationship with their child. And one of my hypotheses is that unmarried fathers who report high levels of relationship satisfaction with a mother will report high levels of father involvement. And with that hypothesis, I was very specific about what I expect to happen. And that is a very key feature of hypotheses and research questions, where you have to be very clear and intentional about what you think will happen or what you expect to happen. And those hypotheses are typically informed by previous research or theory. It's not just something we kind of made up on the fly. Researchers may also try to randomly select people in their study, which means everyone in their population of interest has an equal opportunity to participate in the study, and makes it more likely that one group of people won't heavily affect the study or skew our results. Some studies have been able to do this, and a lot of researchers do have access to these large national data sets. The downside to random sampling, it's hard to obtain, especially in the human sciences fields. It's also very expensive. So you usually have to get huge national or federal grants to kind of collect this research. And unfortunately, these data sets that contain random samples are really hard to achieve. So what will happen is most family researchers have to rely on non-probability sampling. So for example, although I would really love to study unmarried fathers using a random sample, this particular population of interest is hard to track down, and they rarely participate in research at all. So as a result, I have to use what's called non-probability sampling. And that would require me to kind of take any unmarried fathers that are interested in participating in my study. So not just randomly selecting them or getting a list of people and randomly selecting them off this list, but maybe posting on social media or posting on tech announce, like, hey, I'm looking for a sample of unmarried fathers. If you're interested in my study, please email me. And that's what's known as convenience sampling, which is a non-probability sampling method. And it's not the best way to go about it, but sometimes that is what a lot of social scientists have to resort to, just because we either have a very particular population of interest, or we just don't have the funds to access a huge list where we can randomly select our population. So pros and cons to each. Researchers then, after they've figured out who their sample is, how to recruit them, all that good stuff, they'll have to collect the data from participants. One way that we can do this is through surveys, which are usually a questionnaire with a fixed set of questions that measure concepts or constructs of interest. And surveys are great because they're really quick and easy way to collect data from lots of people. And it's really great to kind of disperse that. One of my undergraduate students, they did a survey for their honors project, and they got 800 people to participate. Unfortunately, only about 100 100 surveys were usable. That's a downside of using surveys, is sometimes people don't understand your questions, or they just do it but don't actually give you accurate data. Um, but she got a lot of responses for it, so that was really cool. Another widely used data collection method is observational studies or field research. So to use this data collection method, researchers will go out and directly observe their participants, sometimes by even going into their home to see how they interact as a family. However, this method has some disadvantages because typically we can't have these large samples with observational data, and it takes a really long time to collect this type of data. So one study that I participated in was we would have researchers go into the homes of people and observe play between parents and children for an hour. And it took a lot of time, especially when we needed, 100 families was the goal. So that's 100 hours of observing people, which is a lot, versus like having them complete a 15-minute survey, which is a lot quicker. But yeah, that's a couple ways we can go about collecting data. Finally, we're going to analyze our results and develop our conclusions. So data analysis is kind of tedious. It's a lot of math. Sorry. It's a lot of math, but we get through, and then we typically develop our conclusions, and then we'll typically share those results by presenting at conferences, giving talks to various different universities, and hopefully publishing our work too into peer-reviewed journal articles. All right. So as we go through the semester, we'll learn more about how research is being done in the field of family science and how that affects our understandings of family and family dynamics. Okay. So before we dive into our next topic, now might be a really good time to pause and take a break from lecture and notes. We'll be discussing the various theories used to understand families. We'll discuss 5 different theories in particular, which is going to be important for your theory and history quiz. Those theories are going to be exchange theory, symbolic interaction, feminist theory, postmodern theory, and queer theory. I'm so sorry. I don't know why it keeps randomly switching over to slides. I think it's because maybe I have a timer and it's saying I'm taking too long, but that's okay. So now might be a good time to pause. All right. So our first theory is exchange theory, and it emerged originally from economics theories, but it's been applied to how we understand relationships and how they function. So this theory argues that people are rational beings who decide whether or not to exchange goods and services with others. So goods and services doesn't necessarily mean like work or trade. In this context, the goods and services you would provide to a relationship could include your ability to cook, your stable job, your attractiveness, your social connections, basically anything that is beneficial to the relationship that you could add into that relationship. And before we enter into relationships, we consider the cost, rewards, and alternatives. So costs in a relationship could be considered your partner not knowing how to cook, or they're kind of a slob and they don't really pick up after themselves. So as a result, you may need to clean a little bit more, or you may need to cook more often. Rewards that your partner could bring to the relationship is their social status or social network, which may benefit you, or their house that's been paid off, which is also a huge benefit. Alternatives are anyone else that could do more for you or be a more beneficial partner or connection. So we take kind of all these things into account and decide whether or not the relationship is worth our time and effort. This model is typically applied to the breadwinner and homemaker family, which is married couples with children. And typically it's the father who works full-time for pay, and then the mother does not. So in this dynamic, the father goes to work and earns income for the family to survive, which can be considered a cost to him, but it's a benefit to the relationship. It's a reward that he brings to the table. And although he's working, he is rewarded by not having to take care of household responsibilities or childcare because the mother in this type of family is typically the one to handle all the household duties and child responsibilities, which is a cost to her, but a benefit to the relationship. So it typically evens out. Symbolic interactionism is a theory that argues that people's understanding of the world and their relationships are always changing as we kind of create and sustain meaning within our interactions. So we understand our world by interpreting what others do and say and create meaning from those gestures and words or appearances to understand how our relationships work. So how we understand messages and interactions with others is often reinforced by culture and society. An example of this may be how people interpret a period at the end of a text message. So for younger generations, we tend to interpret a period at the end of a text message as the person who sent the text being upset or frustrated with us. For older generations, they see that period just as a mark to signify the end of the sentence. My mom always ends her text messages with periods, and I'm always worried she's mad or frustrated with me. So we've created meaning around what a period means at the end of the text message, and then that affects our relationship. When we apply this perspective to family science, it can be helpful to examine family relationships in less institutionalized settings. Oftentimes, the theory is used to better understand step families or unmarried couples who share a child. And this theory tends to focus on how people understand their social roles within their family. Feminist theory is a perspective that was developed to help better understand and transform inequalities between men and women specifically. However, this theory is informed by both exchange theory and symbolic interactionism. And although the theory does focus on gender inequality, new frameworks within this theory um, tend to explore other inequalities and how they're structured and enacted in other aspects of life. But we'll talk about this a bit later when we talk about intersectionality. Feminist theorists argue that all gender differences that we see between men and women are constructed by culture and society and typically do not come from biological differences, but how culture and society assigns meaning and rules to men and women. They also argue that these rules that we've created create power differences between men and women, in which men tend to hold more power over women. So, for example, feminist theorists argue that the kind of work that women tend to do is valued less highly than the work that men do. So, for example, women tend to take on more household responsibilities and childcare roles. Oftentimes, it's just assumed that they're supposed to do those things or that they want to do those things. And as a result, they rarely receive recognition for the work that they are doing. However, when men engage in child rearing roles or they take on, more non-traditional roles, like maybe they're an elementary school teacher or they're a nurse, they tend to receive more praise for that, and sometimes they receive better pay for that as well. So again, their work is being praised more often and more highly than a woman's work who's been doing it just as much or for just as long. Feminist theory is typically used to understand gender inequalities in the family, especially in situations like I just mentioned above. It helps us to better understand how roles, specifically gender roles, are going to be negotiated in each family. The postmodern perspective examines changes over the last several decades and how these changes have affected both individuals and families. In this perspective, in the mid to late 19th century, that would be considered the modern era. During this era, choices were often directed by rules or dictated by society and culture and what was expected of everyone, which led to minimal decision making. So, for example, men often took on the trade or jobs that their fathers did or their grandfathers did, and women typically became wives and homemakers since they had very minimal career options available to them. And the career options that were available to them were, house care workers, secretaries, teachers, things like that. So again, very limited options. Much of the modern era is marked by following a specific life path. So, for example, being a student, getting a job, and then getting married and having children in that specific order. The modern era, though, is marked by choice and decision. And it doesn't necessarily have to follow a clear-cut guideline. So now people can follow many different life courses. This period is marked by self-identity, which is a person's sense of who they are and how they are in other structures. And identity development and personal growth is a priority during this era. People tend to develop their identity through a process known as reflexivity, which is the process through which individuals take in knowledge, reflect upon it, and then alter their behaviors, which again is going to affect how they understand who they are in the family, but it also gives them choice in who they are in the family system. So queer theory examines assumptions about sexual and gender identities, monogamy, and the definition of family. Queer theorists tend to reject the idea that there is a dichotomy when it comes to gender and sexuality, but rather they argue that gender and sexuality exist on a spectrum or on a continuum. Similar to postmodern theorists, people construct their own identities, including sexual and gender identities, on this continuum. Within this particular context and within this particular theory, queer refers to individuals who see themselves as operating in a more complex and changing sexual space or identity space. When we look at the male and female dichotomy, queer theorists tend to distinguish this dichotomy as cisgendered and transgendered, which allows for more flexibility on the gender spectrum. So cisgendered people are those whose own sense of gender is consistent with that, with what they were assigned at birth. So, for example, if someone is assigned male at birth and they identify as male as they grow up, they're considered cisgendered. Transgender people are those whose sense of identity or sense of their own gender, I should say, is inconsistent with the gender that they were assigned at birth. So this can include people who transition from male to female, female to male, or people who identify as non-binary. Let's discuss a little bit more how queer theory can be applied to families and family science. So the Census Bureau defines family as two or more people who are related by birth, marriage, or legal adoption and reside together. Queer theorists argue that families should go beyond this limited definition to include people who have close ties, even if they are not related or live together. So, for example, people may include close friends as part of their family, which again kind of goes back to that idea of voluntary kin. Queer theorists also question monogamy, which is the belief that people should only have one long-term partner at a time, usually within the context of marriage. Monogamy is a common practice in our culture, but queer theorists argue that it should not be the only acceptable option. They instead suggest alternatives such as polyamory, which is the practice of having one or more open relationships or romantic relationships at a time, and they may not be limited to marriage. Queer theorists also push back against the idea that families need to include children who are born into or adopted into a family. They argue that limiting having children to these two options reinforces heteronormativity, and that it's not necessarily required for you to have children to be a family. They also push back on the idea that certain family members need to hold more masculine or feminine roles and argue that these roles are and should be considered more fluid. So I mentioned this kind of earlier in our feminist theories slide, but intersectionality is a principle that argues that inequalities that are related to one's social identity often overlap with inequalities that are related to other identities. The major causes of identity and inequality include race and ethnicity, gender, social class, and sexuality, and we'll be discussing each of these throughout the semester. When we examine families and their context, we need to understand how all of these components of identity are going to impact their lived experiences. So, for example, when I study unmarried fathers, I need to consider how their race, their gender, and their social class is going to impact their fathering experiences and what it means for them to be a father, and how inequalities that they may experience could influence how they parent. Now that we've kind of went over, theory, definitions, science, let's talk about other factors or phenomenon that can impact how we understand families. So globalization has become prevalent in our everyday lives. So for example, most of our clothes, shoes, cars, and other goods tend to be manufactured and crafted in a country outside of the United States. In the United States, we tend to hire migrant workers to do labor that people in our country tend to shy away from. Um, and globalization is just a major part of our lives now, and it's changing how families interact. So, for example, in developing countries, the job market, especially for women, has increased as new factories or new job opportunities in the United States have created, more economic independence for these women, and it's changed the rate of marriage in those countries. During my undergrad, I worked on a project that examined how globalization was changing the relationships between parents and children in Thailand. So, in the past, most children tended to live with their parents or close by their parents, take care of them in their old age, and most households or communities were multi-generational in Thailand. However, most teens and young adults in Thailand now wanted to move away from their home, get jobs in bigger cities, and have a stable career that would make them lots of money. And the parents of these children felt that their children were abandoning them. They were abandoning their culture, their family, their way of life for this more modern and globalized lifestyle. So, as a result, the effects of globalization have made Western nations more similar to American culture and family structures. At the same time, though, globalization can be really beneficial because it was acknowledged within the study that both parents and children found that globalization was helpful in keeping the family connected to a certain extent by increasing access to technology, giving these children great job opportunities that allowed them to provide better care for their parents as they got older because they had more money to spend on their parents. So there were some benefits for it though. And although globalization seems like this huge phenomenon or this really big idea, it's like, how can that impact the day-to-day lives of people? It really is changing how families interact with one another and how they adapt to that kind of this growing world. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as the semester goes on. Now we're going to talk about individualism and, the changing ways that we kind of structure our families. So most Americans today still plan on marrying or they, express a desire to marry. However, marriage rates have decreased over the past several decades as cohabitation and non-marital childbearing begin to rise. There's also been an increase in the divorce rate as well. I think it's about half of all marriages today end in divorce. There are a few different reasons as to why marriage is becoming less and less likely or successful today. First, the power of marriage to regulate a person's life has decreased because it's more socially acceptable to cohabitate with a romantic partner or have a child with a romantic partner outside of the confines of marriage. And divorce as well has become more socially acceptable and a little bit more accessible as well, as we've passed laws that allow us to have no fault divorces. Marriage is also not necessary for women today who in the past used to have to rely on man's income to financially survive, but now women have a lot of economic dependence, so marriage isn't a requirement anymore. Ideas about marriage and its purpose have also taken a more individualistic perspective. So, individualism is the style of life in which individuals pursue their own interests and place greater importance on developing a personally rewarding life. There's two types of individualism that we usually see. There's utilitarian individualism and expressive individualism. Utilitarian individualism emphasizes personal achievement and self-reliance. It tends to be similar to the idea of, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, the idea that if you work hard enough, you can achieve anything you set your mind to, which is very much a part of the American dream narrative that we see. On the other hand, expressive individualism tends to focus on developing feelings and emotional satisfaction. We see this in the idea that you can have a happily ever after if you just find the right person. Um, it's also why people today tend to marry for love and happiness rather than for more practical reasons like financial stability or increasing social status, things like that. Individualism, at the end of the day, emphasizes autonomy and personal choice above all, which is why some people argue that the divorce rate may be caused by individualism because once that relationship is no longer fulfilling, people are more likely to divorce if they have a strong sense of individualism. In an individualistic society, too, adults will construct their families if they deem it personally fulfilling and if it will improve their overall self development. So, if people are wary of marriage or see no benefit to it, they're less likely to marry and more likely to pursue other personal fulfilling things like getting a degree or having a successful career. People today also consider marriage a personal achievement and a status that you work towards, as most people wait until they are financially stable and emotionally mature enough to marry. However, families and its structure are also dependent on choice and how the individual views it. So, as we discuss family throughout the semester, we'll be talking about we'll be talking about families as a social institution, which is a set of rules that define a social unit or its importance in society. So we'll be able to examine various roles like the role of a parent, romantic partner, ex-spouse, grandparent, child, etc. And all of these roles have very different meanings and functions within the family unit. And it also impacts how society is going to interact with them in different ways. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for what the public and private family is, we've discussed various theoretical frames and how the family is hard to define and how it's going to change. Now we'll look at all types of family dynamics, histories, things like that. So it's going to be a really exciting semester. All right. Let's move on to lecture 2.